Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the beating heart of New York, beneath the dazzling lights of the skyscrapers, lived Alexander Harrington, a billionaire renowned for his intelligence, his wealth, and his intransigence. Nothing could shake him, he believed, not the riskiest deals, not the most high-profile scandals. Yet a personal decision would soon turn his perfectly organized world upside down. One winter morning, with the city shrouded in a veil of glittering snow, Alexander received an unexpected visitor, a little girl of about 8 years old, with bright eyes and a keen intelligence, sitting on a bench in the park he walked through daily. Her story was simple and heartbreaking. She had lost her parents in a tragic accident, and no one could or would care for her. Against all odds, and despite the whispers of those close to him who called him crazy for considering adopting an unknown child, Alexander decided to take her home. Rumors spread quickly. Harrington's out of his mind. Adopt an orphan? The newspaper headlines were already mocking him, but he couldn't ignore the curiosity and the spark of intelligence he saw in the little girl's eyes. What no one yet knew was that this child seemed to have an exceptional gift. Soon, she surprised Alexander by solving complex problems, understanding scientific concepts that even some of his most renowned teachers struggled to explain, and coming up with ingenious solutions to the most improbable challenges. Every day, she was redefining what Alexander thought he knew about intelligence and genius. And little by little, the crazy billionaire in the eyes of the world discovered that, sometimes, true genius is not measured by wealth or power, but by the ability to see what no one else sees. The icy January wind swept through the streets of New York, stirring the fallen leaves and advertising papers. Alexander Harrington, like every morning, left his penthouse for a brisk walk before diving into his business. A man of routine, he loved discipline and predictability. But this morning, nothing went as planned. On a bench in Central Park, a little girl sat alone, bundled up in a coat that was too big for her. Her dark eyes shone with an intense light, almost strange for a child her age. Alexander stopped, intrigued. He was used to seeing homeless people and lost children, but something about this little girl captivated him. "Hello," he asked softly, afraid of frightening her. "Hello," she replied calmly, her voice surprisingly calm for a child. He immediately noted the way she articulated each word precisely, as if she weighed each syllable. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Yes, sir. And I have nowhere to go," she replied without looking up. A brief silence fell. Alexander felt a strange weight in his chest, a kind of protective impulse he had never felt before. Without thinking, he offered. "Come with me. You'll stay at my place while we find a solution." She looked at him, surprised. A slight smile played on her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." He frowned. How did she know his name? This first meeting was discreet, but it marked the beginning of a relationship that would defy all expectations. What no one knew yet was that this child wasn't simply lost or vulnerable, she possessed a mind capable of surpassing the most brilliant genius. And Alexander, for his part, had just opened the door to a world he never suspected. The first evening at the Harrington residence was silent. Alexander, though accustomed to ruling empires, found himself disconcerted by the mere presence of a child in his life. He watched the little girl from the corner of the living room, noting every gesture, every glance. The next morning, he decided to discreetly test her intelligence. On the breakfast table, he left a complex puzzle that his associates sometimes used to stimulate their teams. The little girl sat down, examined the pieces carefully, and in less than 15 minutes, had completed the puzzle. "You're fast," Alexander remarked, slightly surprised. "It's not just speed, Mr. Harrington," she replied calmly. "I understand patterns," she explained, pointing to certain combinations of parts. Alexander froze. Her voice was not only precise, it was almost scientific, as if she had learned advanced concepts that even he had to study to understand. Then, later that day, he noticed something even more surprising. In his office, Alexander was working on a series of complex financial calculations, a new business merger project. The girl approached and, with a quick glance at the figures, pointed out an error that Alexander hadn't even noticed. "How did you see that?" he asked, stunned. "That makes sense, sir. The numbers have to balance out, otherwise, the project will fail," she explained with disconcerting seriousness. Alexander felt a mixture of pride and fear. This child seemed to possess an innate genius, capable of understanding and analyzing concepts that would take many adults years to master. As he looked at her, he realized that his impulsive choice to adopt her could change his life, and his world. But at that moment, he didn't yet know how much it would turn every aspect of his life upside down. As the days passed, Alexander began to get used to the little girl's presence in his home. But what he hadn't anticipated was that her exceptional intelligence wouldn't be limited to puzzles or numbers. One morning, while preparing a crucial presentation for a meeting of international investors, he found himself stuck on a complex problem: how to reorganize a struggling subsidiary without losing millions. The girl, who had been silently watching him from the corner of the office, gently placed her hand on a pile of documents. "Why not restructure using a phased model rather than centralizing everything?" she suggested. Alexander stared at her incredulously. The proposal seemed almost too simple to be effective. Yet, he decided to try it. Upon implementing his idea, he found that not only did the plan work, but it was more profitable than he had imagined. "You just saved millions," he murmured, impressed. "I didn't save them, sir. I simply saw them where they could be better used," she replied calmly. In the days that followed, the girl continued to amaze Alexander. She anticipated economic trends, corrected mistakes even his best analysts had missed, and proposed creative solutions to complex problems. Each success reinforced his admiration, but also his fear. How could a child have such a sharp mind? Rumors were beginning to spread through the business world: Alexander Harrington had adopted a prodigy. Some laughed at him, calling him crazy, while others were curious to see what this little girl could accomplish. But in the silence of his office, Alexander was beginning to understand a shocking truth: he had just opened the door to an intelligence capable of rivaling his own, and perhaps surpassing it. A few weeks after her arrival, the girl's presence in Alexander's life began to be noticed outside of his office. At a social gathering held at his penthouse, longtime investors and partners came to congratulate him on his recent financial decisions, completely unaware of the game-changing factor. The little girl, sitting calmly in a corner, watched the crowd with curious eyes. Alexander, at first embarrassed by the idea that she might intervene in a world he thought was reserved for adults, looked at her attentively. "Alexander, why are people behaving like this?" she asked suddenly, pointing at some of the guests who were pretending to be friendly. He smiled softly. "It's the business world. Many smiles hide interests," he replied. She frowned, as if that explanation weren't enough. A few minutes later, an investor asked Alexander a trick question about a recent acquisition. The girl, unprompted, whispered a strategic remark under her breath. Alexander, following her advice, answered precisely, completely disarming his interlocutor and impressing the entire audience. "You just saved me from humiliation," he said in a low voice, with a mixture of astonishment and admiration. "I didn't save you. I showed you what you couldn't see," she replied simply, with that disconcerting calm that fascinated him. After that evening, Alexander began to realize that those around him saw not just a child, but a genius capable of influencing even the most delicate situations in his social and professional life. The whispers around him became more insistent: "Harrington has lost his mind, or he has found a prodigy." And for the first time, he understood that this girl wasn't just going to change the way he worked, she was going to transform his entire life. Over time, the girl became increasingly integrated into Alexander's daily life. But what he hadn't anticipated was her influence on the personal problems that had been bothering him for years. One evening, when he came home late from work, Alexander found the girl immersed in her papers. She had been carefully studying the financial documents of his charitable foundation, an organization he had run for a long time but whose results had never been truly satisfactory. "Mr. Harrington," she said calmly, "you are spreading your resources too thin. If you focus your donations on 3 key projects, the impact will be much greater and more measurable, she explained. Alexander was struck. He had spent millions trying to help, but without ever really creating concrete change. His advice was precise, logical, almost surgical. Following his plan, he reorganized the foundation, and in just a few weeks, the results were spectacular. "You changed my foundation, and maybe the lives of hundreds of people," he murmured, impressed. "I only showed what was possible," she replied with her disconcerting simplicity. But his genius didn't stop there. A few days later, Alexander faced a family problem he'd been avoiding for years, reconnecting with his estranged brother, with whom he'd broken up after a business disagreement. The girl, observing the letters and messages exchanged, proposed a strategic approach to repairing ties and preparing for a stress-free meeting. "Sometimes you have to understand each other's motivations before you speak," she explained. With her guidance, Alexander was able to re-establish a precious relationship, something he thought was lost forever. He realized then that this child wasn't just a business genius, she saw life and human relationships with exceptional clarity. And in the silence of his office, he asked himself, how can a single child understand all this while I, an adult, struggle to do so? One morning, Alexander received an alarming call. One of his flagship companies was experiencing an unexpected crisis. A major overseas project was at risk of costly failure due to an unpredictable partner and misinterpreted legal documents. Executives were panicking, and investors were beginning to lose confidence. Alexander felt the tension rising. But beside him, the girl remained calm, watching the screens and reports with uncommon concentration. "Mr. Harrington," she said after a few minutes, "if you restructure the agreement by proposing a clause that no one had considered, you will regain control of the situation," she explained. Alexander raised an eyebrow. He was well versed in legal and financial matters. What she proposed was bold, almost risky, but her logic was implacable. With a mixture of apprehension and confidence, he followed her instructions. A few hours later, the situation had completely changed. The agreement was renegotiated, the partner respected the new clauses, and the company emerged not only unscathed, but stronger than before. The executives were stunned, and Alexander felt a mixture of pride and astonishment. "How did you know all this?" he asked, unable to hide his admiration. "I see the patterns, sir. When everything seems chaotic, you just have to understand the motivations and strengths of each part," she replied with that disconcerting calm that always fascinated him. This experience marked a turning point. Alexander understood that his daughter was not just a prodigy in theory or at home, but a true strategist capable of handling complex crises in the real world. And in his mind, a certainty grew: adopting this child had been the boldest and most brilliant decision of his life. A few months had passed since the girl's adoption. Alexander had learned to trust her in all sorts of situations, but what he hadn't anticipated was the growing media attention. It all began at a charity gala, broadcast live on television. A delicate situation arose. An influential donor threatened to withdraw his support, dissatisfied with the distribution of funds. Alexander felt embarrassment rising, but the girl, as always, remained calm. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "you just have to show him the concrete benefit he will have from his projects, without going into complicated financial details." Alexander followed her advice. With a concise and strategic explanation, he not only managed to appease the donor, but also to secure an additional commitment. The cameras caught everything, and soon the news spread: the billionaire had found a prodigy capable of handling the most delicate situations with exceptional intelligence. Social media went wild. Newspaper headlines read, "The child prodigy who saved Harrington," and "Alexander Harrington and his brilliant daughter." Some mocked, others admired, but everyone was intrigued. "You see, Mr. Harrington," she said with a calm smile, "people don't see the logic behind emotions, but I can guide them to act properly." Alexander smiled in awe. He was beginning to understand that his role was no longer just that of a parent or a boss. He was a privileged witness to a genius capable of transforming the world around her. And as the spotlight shone on them, he knew their story was only just beginning. The girl was no longer just a closely guarded secret. She was about to become a force to be reckoned with, capable of influencing people far beyond their inner circle. A few months after the gala incident, a far more complex problem arose. An Alexander subsidiary abroad was facing an unexpected diplomatic crisis. A dispute with international partners threatened to escalate into a major legal and economic conflict. Ambassadors and lawyers were on alert, and the situation seemed out of control. Alexander, aware of the gravity of the situation, summoned the girl to his office. She quickly examined all the documents, contracts, and diplomatic messages, her eyes scanning the information with frightening precision. "Mr. Harrington," she said calmly, "the problem is not legal, but strategic. If you create a mediation protocol that takes into account the interests of each party and anticipates their reactions, you can turn this conflict into an opportunity," she explained. Alexander, although surprised by the clarity and depth of her analysis, decided to follow her instructions. She drafted a detailed plan with him, anticipating every objection and possible compromise. At the diplomatic meeting, Alexander outlined the plan he had developed with the girl. Every clause, every nuance, seemed to meet the expectations of the international partners even before they expressed them. In just a few hours, the crisis was resolved, and what seemed like a potential disaster turned into an innovative and profitable agreement. "I've never seen anyone analyze a situation so quickly," murmured an impressed diplomat. "She has a rare gift," Alexander replied proudly, but also with a touch of wonder. This success quickly spread throughout international business circles. The girl's reputation surpassed that of her father. Some began to speak of her as a genius capable of solving problems that entire teams struggled to manage. Alexander realized, for the first time, that his choice to adopt this child hadn't just changed his personal or professional life, he had just created an impact that would resonate far beyond New York, throughout the world. Despite all his professional and media success, Alexander was beginning to feel an emotional void. The deals, contracts, and resolved crises never fully filled the sense of loneliness he'd felt since his youth. The girl, though so young, seemed to understand what no adult could. One evening, while Alexander was working late in his office, she came in with a notebook in her hand. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "I've noticed that you're often alone even when you're surrounded by people. Perhaps you need to share your thoughts rather than keeping everything to yourself." He looked at her, surprised. A child who spoke of feelings and emotions with such lucidity. It disarmed him. "And what do you propose?" he asked, a bitter smile on his lips. "Right. Talk about your ideas, your fears, your plans. I can help you organize your thoughts," she explained calmly. At first, Alexander hesitated. But by following her advice, he discovered a way to free himself from his stress and anxiety. Every evening, they spent time together talking, analyzing past situations, and imagining future solutions. This process revealed yet another aspect of the girl's genius. She wasn't just good at solving logical or strategic problems, she was also good at understanding and guiding human emotions. Alexander found himself sharing secrets and memories he'd never confided to anyone. "You're not just brilliant," he murmured one evening, "you're amazing, in every possible way." "I am only a reflection of what you are prepared to see," she replied with the calm and maturity that fascinated him. For Alexander, this realization was overwhelming. He had found not only a brilliant child, but also a partner capable of helping him understand the world, people, and himself. Months had turned into years, and the little girl had grown up under Alexander's admiring eyes. What had started as a risky adoption had turned out to be the most brilliant decision of his life. His daughter was no longer just a child prodigy, she had become a major influence in his professional, social, and emotional life. One morning, Alexander received a letter from an international investor who had heard about the girl. The message was clear: he wanted to collaborate directly with her, convinced that her genius could solve problems that even the most experienced teams struggled to manage. Alexander smiled, proud but not surprised. He had known for a long time that this child would make his mark on the world. But it wasn't just his career that had changed. Their father-daughter bond had become deep and unbreakable. Every decision they made together, every project, every problem solved, strengthened their bond and mutual admiration. Alexander had learned to listen not just to a genius, but to an exceptional heart. One evening, as they looked out at the New York skyline from the penthouse together, Alexander whispered. You know, everyone thought I was crazy to adopt you. But now I realize I was the lucky one. The girl smiled, placing her hand on his. And I, Mr. Harrington, am happy to have found a father who sees beyond appearances. Alexander realized then that their story was more than just a career success or a newfound prodigy, it was a complete life transformation. A lesson no one else could have taught him except her. And as the city shone around them, he knew this unlikely duo, a billionaire and his prodigy daughter, would leave a lasting mark on the world.